Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about the benefits, but also the potential pitfalls of reading extracts and doing close readings. Everyone who has frequented my channel knows I love close reading. I love taking a sample of a text, a scene from a text, and going through it and picking out all of those details, how the sentences are structured, how the paragraphs are structured, how the white space is being used, the different language choices that an author has made, what is being overtly communicated, what is context and subtext. I am a huge fan of close reading. I'm a huge fan of practicing on poems and taking these dense, intricate, complex, short pieces and exploring all of the different things that we can get from it, exploding it all outwards in terms of meaning and understanding and what we feel and what we get from it. I'm a big fan of all of this stuff. But there is a potential pitfall to close reading. There is a potential pitfall to taking extracts and excerpts. And one of the things is if that is how we focus on things, it can lead us to forgetting to put the scene back into the context. So, what I mean by this, let me try and give an example that hopefully will illustrate this. Let's say, for instance, we're reading Macbeth. We're going to read Macbeth, we're going to try and understand Macbeth. And a question comes up: how is Lady Macbeth presented within the text? So, naturally, the very first thing that we do is we look at the scenes that Lady Macbeth is in, because we've been asked, how is she presented within the text? So we take those scenes and we lift them out of the text and we go, right, in order to answer this question, I'm going to look at how Lady Macbeth is presented in each of these scenes that she is in. It seems absolutely logical. It is something that we see increasingly in how literature is taught, a focus on extracts. What's the potential pitfall to this? I hear my straw man argument in the background say. The potential pitfall, or at least one of the potential pitfalls, is right. What was the base norm for the text for how any character is presented? Well, we don't know. We've because we were so focused on Lady Macbeth, we didn't look to see how any of the other characters were presented. So we're not thinking about Lady Macbeth in the play anymore. We're just thinking about Lady Macbeth in those scenes. And we're not thinking about how, say, Macbeth is presented, how Macduff is presented, how Banquo is presented. We're not thinking about how the other characters have been presented. And because of that, we don't know what emphasis is being placed on Lady Macbeth because we don't have a base norm. We don't have the standard of how other characters are to try and get a sense of how all characters are presented and then look at the variance that we see with Lady Macbeth. We don't know, is Lady Macbeth the only woman in the text who has a speaking part? We don't know that because all we looked at was Lady Macbeth. And this is quite often what I mean by when I talk about close reading, so you have to put it back into context. And this came up not so long ago. There was some discussion, and it was a regular comment that has been coming up over the last, I don't know, 15 years about a particular sequence in one of the Malazan books. And in this sequence, people would focus on it and they go, look at what's being done in this sequence. I don't like this. This is bad. And if that sequence was all there was, that would be a much more compelling reading. Because if that was all the evidence, you go, yeah, I can see how you make that argument. That argument makes sense. If this is the size of the narrative and that's what's there, I can see that. I still might not agree fully with everything that you did, but I can see where you're coming from. But the problem was this was a sequence in a chapter partway through a book. that has preceding chapters that the character appeared in, has succeeding chapters that the character appears in. And so people were looking at this sequence outside of its context. And again, it's a very valid way to study. It's what we do with close reading. We look at these things. But because we discount the information gleaned from other scenes, we get a very skewed picture because that scene did not happen in a vacuum. That scene did not occur without the rest of the narrative. That scene is constructed to follow on from preceding scenes and to have subsequent scenes. It is meant to be working as part of an arc, of part of a development, of part of a bigger, wider, more cohesive whole. And this is the danger, or sorry, this is a potential danger of focusing on extracts, that they are not the whole thing. One of the reasons why I love looking at prologues, why I love looking at opening sequences, for a start, the author knows that the person reading does not have context, does not have anything else. So we're getting a truer sense of this is the thing on the page. You don't have any prior knowledge. See what develops. And because of that, because there isn't prior knowledge needed, that's a good starting point. But if I did a close reading from much later on, then I have to be aware that I need to put the scene back into its context because I have removed it from its context. I've removed it from the preceding scenes that may have contained very significant evidence for what is actually developed in that scene. And if there are subsequent scenes, then I have to be aware that that scene may be setting something up for the future. Now, obviously, that won't affect how you felt when you read the scene. We have our initial reactions to things. But if we focus on this scene is bad, or this scene is problematic, or this scene is doing something that is bad, or problematic, or something that the narrator, the character, the author is going to be criticized for, then we have to consider all of the evidence that builds to that and all of the evidence that flows from that. Because that's the only way that we can actually evaluate the thing, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. But a lot of our educational focus is on using extracts, not full texts. Focus on an extract, concentrate on what's in front of you, answer the question, move on to the next extract and the set of questions associated with that. We train this way of thinking. We train in this mode of thinking. And we're not training necessarily our ability to think of a narrative unit being larger than that. Take, for instance, if you read The Scarlet Letter and The Crucible, and then you compare and contrast between the different texts. That is an older style of teaching. It used to be very, very common that you would have similarly themed texts or texts that are about similar aspects and stories and narratives. And we would study them all. And yeah, we would do close readings. We would go through things. But ultimately, the other thing that was part of that education was thinking about the relationship between texts, the conversation between texts, the conversation between that text and its genre. If a text is a fantasy epic and it was written in the 1980s, that is a very different context, not just in terms of society, in terms of the genre. But an epic fantasy text written in the 1980s is very different to an epic fantasy text that's written in the 2020s. The genre has evolved, the genre has changed, the genre has been building on and learning from previous things. The genre has gotten tired of certain aspects and wanted to explore new things. The genre has played around with something, realized it didn't work, and has moved on to something else. different books come out over time, and authors are influenced by it. Readers are influenced by them. How we think about different concepts is changed over time. And again, picking something out in isolation and analyzing it in isolation is not necessarily a bad thing. There's no such thing as sort of like bad attention to the studying of these texts. Like that is a skill. It's a skill I love to see other people utilize. But if we forget about context, that can lead to our potential misinterpretation of something, or potentially misclassify something, mislabel something, or misunderstand something. Those are all potential negative outcomes. Context is incredibly important. Is it always the most important thing? No, of course not. And one of the issues that we always face is we can never have perfect information. We cannot know everything the author was thinking when they were writing. We can't know everything that the author read that encouraged them to write this, or saw, or experienced. But the more information we have, the more context we have, the better our information is. That leads us quite often to more interesting and more insightful ways of understanding the text. And it's not about finding the one true meaning. It's about understanding levels of knowledge and how levels of knowledge can encourage us to see other things. And so while I so strongly recommend developing close reading, developing those skills about breaking down sentences, word choice, patterns, taking little sections out to study them in depth. I am all in favor of that. But depending on what judgment we are going to level at things, depending on what we are using that information for, what argument we are constructing, it may be very, very necessary to put it back in context, to think about the other characters in Macbeth, not just the one that we were focused on answering the question about. Because establishing base norms, establishing other patterns, seeing how, if this thing is representative of that pattern or is in contradiction to that pattern, is it in conversation with that pattern? All of these are important questions that cannot be answered if we make that analytical assumption that the scene in question operates in a vacuum. And that's all I'm saying. Close reading is brilliant. Reading extracts is brilliant. Reading excerpts is brilliant. Analyzing these things can be so revelatory about an author's style, about what they're doing. And ultimately, we may end up using that scene for an argument that we make. But if the scene was part of a context, if it was part of a narrative that was developed, then quite often, how other things are done in the narrative, other revelations about the character, how the character acts and reacts to things, that can have a major impact in our understanding. Because the scene doesn't operate in a vacuum. Unless, of course, it's a vignette, but even then, the vignette has been placed in that context at that point for a reason. And so, when we use scenes to illustrate something, we have to be aware of the context. And quite often, if we lift things out of context, we can end up misrepresenting them or misunderstanding them. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.